Welcome to Night Shift Pulse. Comment your city and the time below. The night connects us all. If you enjoy what you hear, please subscribe. Let's step into the dark. Story 1. Camera 3 never blinked. I watched myself sedate a patient I had not yet admitted. The timestamp read 11:27 p.m., 43 minutes before she would arrive at intake. My hand moved with precision I had not yet performed, adjusting the IV drip with muscle memory I had not yet formed. When she finally did arrive at midnight 10, she flinched at my touch as though recognizing something familiar. The footage had already archived the interaction twice. My name is Laura Whitmore, and I have been a psychiatric intake nurse at Millridge Behavioral Health for 11 years. My role involves patient assessment, documentation, compliance monitoring, and the routine review of security footage to verify adherence to intake protocols. The facility operates under strict legal and medical oversight, and every interaction is captured across 47 cameras distributed throughout admissions, hallways, observation rooms, and common areas. Camera 3 is mounted in Intake Room B, angled to capture the full room from door to exam table. It has been operational since the facility opened in 2009. It has never malfunctioned. It has never lost signal. It has never blinked. I began my shift on the evening of October 14th at 7 p.m. The night was routine. 3 admissions were scheduled: a voluntary commitment at 8:30, a court-mandated evaluation at 10:15, and an emergency intake flagged by county services at midnight 10. I completed the first 2 without incident. Both were cooperative, both were logged, both were archived. At 11 p.m. I returned to the intake coordinator's desk to review the evening's footage as procedural policy required. I accessed the digital archive system, filtered by date and camera, and began playback at 7 p.m. The first hour showed standard activity. I appeared on screen at 7:03, unlocking the intake office and preparing examination materials. At 8:32, the first patient arrived. I escorted him to Intake Room A. Camera 2 captured the full session. At 10:17, the second patient arrived. I brought her to Intake Room B. Camera 3 captured that session as well. I fast-forwarded through both, checking timestamps, verifying sedation logs, confirming compliance. Everything matched my documentation. Everything was procedural. Everything was correct. Then I continued playback into the time between the second and third admissions. From 10:54 to midnight, the facility was quiet. I had spent that time updating charts, restocking medication drawers, and preparing for the emergency intake. I remembered it clearly. I had been alone at the coordinator's desk the entire time. But when I reached the 11:27 timestamp on camera 3, the screen showed movement. Intake Room B was occupied. A woman sat on the exam table, her hospital gown wrinkled, her wrists marked with faint ligature abrasions. I stood beside her, adjusting an IV stand, drawing medication into a syringe. My posture was relaxed. My movements were efficient. I spoke to her calmly, though the footage had no audio. I watched myself check her vitals, update her chart, and confirm the sedation dosage. The session lasted 12 minutes. At 11:39, I escorted her to the hallway and handed her off to an orderly I recognized as Marcus Flynn. The footage ended. The timestamp advanced to 11:40. The room was empty again. I sat at the desk, staring at the screen. I had not entered Intake Room B between 10:54 and midnight. I had not admitted a patient at 11:27. I had been seated at the coordinator's desk, alone, reviewing charts and preparing intake forms. I checked the timestamp again. 11:27 p.m., October 14th. I checked my own notes. No entry. I checked the patient registry. No name matched. I checked Marcus's shift log. He had not been scheduled that evening. I closed the footage and returned to my desk. I told myself it was a system glitch, a duplicated file, a corrupted timestamp. I continued preparing for the midnight 10 admission. At 12:07, the emergency intake arrived. Her name was Rachel Everly. She was 29 years old, brought in by County Crisis Response following a suicide attempt. She was disoriented, sedated by paramedics, unresponsive to verbal prompts. I escorted her to intake room B. Camera 3 would capture the session. As I guided her to the exam table, she flinched. Her body stiffened. She turned toward me, her eyes glassy but focused, and whispered, "You already did this." I paused. "This is your intake evaluation, Rachel. You just arrived." She shook her head slowly. "You already touched me. You already gave me the shot. I remember your voice." I completed the intake. I followed protocol. I sedated her, logged the interaction, transferred her to observation. But her words stayed with me. At 1:30 a.m., after Rachel had been moved, I returned to the archive system. I opened the footage for camera 3 and jumped to 11:27 p.m. The session I had watched earlier was still there. I froze the frame at 11:31, zooming in on the patient's face. It was Rachel Everly. The woman I had admitted at midnight 10 had been documented 43 minutes earlier. Same gown, same abrasions, same disorientation. The footage showed me performing the exact intake I would later conduct in real time. I checked the metadata. The file was labeled October 14th, 11:27 p.m., Camera 3, Intake Room B. It was not corrupted. It was not duplicated. It was archived as a verified event. I reported the discrepancy to the night supervisor, a man named Gerald Pritchard who had worked in facility administration for 13 years. He reviewed the footage with me in silence. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair and said, "The system timestamps when the footage is recorded, not when it's uploaded. If the camera's internal clock drifted, it could mislabel the file." I pointed to the hallway camera outside intake room B. "Check the hallway feed at 11:27. If the session happened, Marcus would appear escorting Rachel to observation." Gerald pulled up the hallway footage. At 11:27 p.m., the hallway was empty. No patient, no orderly, no movement. But at 11:39, the exact moment camera 3 showed me escorting Rachel out, the hallway feed showed nothing. Gerald closed the file. "It's a ghost image. The camera recorded over itself. It happens with older systems." But camera 3 was not an older system. It was replaced in 2020. It operated on isolated storage with automatic redundancy. It could not record over itself. Gerald dismissed the issue and instructed me to continue my shift. I returned to the intake desk, but I could not stop reviewing the footage. I opened it again at 2:15 a.m., watching frame by frame. At 11:34, Rachel turned her head toward the camera. For one frame, her eyes locked with the lens. In the next frame, she looked away. Over the following week, I reviewed every archived file from camera 3. I found 3 additional instances of pre-recorded intake sessions. Each showed me admitting patients I had not yet encountered. Each timestamp preceded the actual admission by 30 to 50 minutes. In every case, the patient flinched or hesitated when I touched them during the real intake, as though experiencing déjà vu. I documented each incident in a confidential memo to facility administration. I received no response. On October 22nd, I admitted a patient named Daniel Oakes, a 51-year-old man brought in following a manic episode. I escorted him to intake room B. As I prepared the sedation, he looked at me and said, "You're going to draw the medication now. You'll use your left hand. You'll touch my shoulder first." I stared at him. "How do you know that?" He smiled faintly. "Because you already did." I completed the intake in silence. At 3 a.m., I accessed the archive. The footage showed me admitting Daniel at 2:14 a.m., 46 minutes before he had arrived. Every movement matched. Every gesture was identical. I filed a second memo. This time, Gerald responded in person. He met me in the archive room at 4:30 a.m. and said, "Laura, you're documenting ghost images. The system is flagging them as errors. If you continue reporting these, it will trigger an external audit. That means state review, potential facility downtime, staff reassignments. Drop it." I asked him if he had reviewed the footage himself. He said he had. I asked him if he saw the patients. He said he saw corrupted frames. I asked him why the patients remembered interactions that had not yet occurred. He told me I was projecting anxiety onto disoriented individuals and that I should consider a leave of absence. I did not take a leave. I continued reviewing Camera 3. By early November, the pre-recorded sessions began appearing closer to the real intake times. At first, they preceded the actual event by 40 minutes, then 30, then 20. On November 9th, I admitted a patient named Claire Hobson. The archived footage showed her intake session beginning at 10:51 p.m. The real session began at 10:53 p.m., a 2-minute gap. On November 12th, I admitted a patient named Aaron Voss. The footage showed the session at 1:06 a.m. The real session began at 1:06 a.m., no gap. But the archived footage had been uploaded 11 seconds earlier. I watched both files side by side. They were identical, frame for frame, movement for movement. But one had been logged before it occurred. On November 15th, I was scheduled for a double shift covering intake and observation. At 9:47 p.m., I entered intake room B to prepare for an incoming patient. The room was empty. The lights were off. I flipped the switch and crossed to the exam table to lay out materials. As I turned toward the door, I saw movement on the wall-mounted monitor that displayed the live feed from Camera 3. The screen showed me standing at the exam table laying out materials, but I was standing at the door. I looked at the monitor. My reflection moved independently. On screen, I turned toward the camera and mouthed something I could not hear. Then the feed cut to static for 3 seconds. When it resumed, I was alone. I checked the time, 9:48 p.m. I left the room and accessed the archive from the coordinator's desk. The footage from 9:47 to 9:48 showed me entering the room, preparing materials, turning toward the camera and mouthing words. The file was labeled Live Capture. Timestamp 9:47 p.m. It had already archived. I reported the incident immediately. Gerald reviewed the footage and said the monitor had displayed a buffered loop, a common delay in live feeds. I told him the footage had archived in real time. He told me the archive system timestamps on upload, not capture, and that the file had been mislabeled. I asked why I appeared on camera before I had entered the room. He did not answer. The following night, I did not review the footage. I completed my intake sessions, logged my documentation, and left the facility at 7:30 a.m. But when I returned that evening, Gerald was waiting at the coordinator's desk. He pulled up the archive from the previous night and played a file from Camera 3 timestamped at 11:51 p.m. The footage showed me entering intake room B. I was not wearing my uniform. I was wearing the clothes I had worn home. I moved calmly through the room, organizing supplies, adjusting the IV stand, preparing the exam table. Then I turned toward the camera and stood still. I stared directly into the lens for 11 seconds. My expression was neutral. Then I walked out. The timestamp, read 11:51 p.m., November 16th. I had left the facility 5 hours earlier. Gerald closed the file. Laura, this footage was archived during your scheduled off hours. If you entered the facility outside your shift without clocking in, that's a policy violation. If you're experiencing dissociative episodes, that's a medical issue. Either way, you need to take a leave. I told him I had not returned to the facility. I told him I had been home. I told him to check the access logs. He pulled up the badge system. My credentials had been used to unlock the intake wing at 11:49 p.m., 2 minutes before the footage. I stared at the log. I had been asleep at 11:49 p.m. I had not left my apartment. I had not used my badge. Gerald placed me on administrative leave effective immediately. I was instructed to surrender my access credentials in return for a fitness for duty evaluation in 2 weeks. I complied. I went home. I did not return to Millridge for 16 days. On December 2nd, I received a call from facility administration requesting that I return to review incident documentation related to my leave. I was told the review was procedural and non-disciplinary. I returned at 2 p.m. Gerald met me in the archive room and opened a folder containing 43 flagged files from Camera 3. Each file showed me entering intake room B during my leave. Each was time-stamped between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. In some, I organized supplies. In others, I sat at the exam table staring at the camera. In one, I stood at the door for 19 minutes without moving. Gerald asked if I had entered the facility during my leave. I said no. He asked if I had loaned my badge to anyone. I said no. He asked if I had any medical conditions that could explain dissociative behavior. I said no. He closed the folder and said, "Non, Laura, you appear in 43 files during a period when you were not employed on site. Your badge was not used. The doors were not unlocked. But the footage is verified and archived. I don't know how to classify this." I asked to see the footage. He played the most recent file, dated December 1st at 2:37 a.m. I watched myself enter intake room B, walk to the exam table and sit down. I stared at the camera for 7 minutes, then I stood, walked to the door and turned back toward the lens. I mouthed 3 words. Gerald paused the footage. I leaned closer to the screen. My lips were clear. I had said, "She is coming." Gerald asked if I understood what I meant. I told him I did not. He archived the file and escorted me out. I was placed on indefinite leave pending further review. I have not returned to Millridge since, but I have continued accessing the archive remotely using my old credentials, which were never deactivated. Camera 3 is still recording. I appear in the footage 3 to 4 times per week. I enter the room. I prepare materials. I stare at the camera. And every session ends the same way. I mouth the same 3 words. Some recordings play before I remember making them, some play after. But the footage never stops. And the timestamp keeps updating even when I am not there. Story 2. The corridor with no floor plan. The camera labeled Hallway D17 appeared in the system without installation paperwork. I assumed it was mislabeled, but the footage showed patients I recognized being escorted by staff I knew, walking through a corridor that had never been built. I pulled up the facility blueprints. D17 did not exist, yet the feed archived every night at 2:41 a.m., showing orderlies guiding patients calmly toward a door that opened into static. My name is Tom Briggs, and I have been the security supervisor at Millridge Behavioral Health for 14 years. My responsibilities include overseeing surveillance operations, coordinating incident response, managing access control, and maintaining the facility's 47-camera digital monitoring system. I know every hallway, every stairwell, every blind corner. I know the wiring schematics, the camera placements, the coverage gaps. I know the facility by blueprint and by memory. I have walked every corridor hundreds of times. There are 41 distinct hallways across 3 floors. Each is labeled by wing and sequence. A1 through A9 in administration, B1 through B14 in clinical services, C1 through C12 in observation and housing, and D1 through D6 in the secure treatment wing. There is no hallway D17. On the night of November 3rd, I was conducting a routine audit of archived surveillance files. The audit was procedural, required quarterly to verify system integrity, check for corrupted footage, and ensure timestamp accuracy. I filtered the archive by date and location, reviewing files in sequence. As I scrolled through the list, a camera label appeared that I did not recognize. Hallway D17. The file was dated November 2nd at 2:41 a.m. I assumed it was a labeling error, likely a duplicated file mislabeled during an automatic upload. I opened it. The footage showed a long corridor, narrow and institutional, lit by overhead fluorescents spaced every 12 feet. The walls were painted the same pale green used throughout the facility. The floor was polished white tile with a gray safety stripe running down the center. At the far end of the hallway, approximately 60 feet from the camera, was a set of double doors with wire-reinforced glass windows. The hallway was empty for the first 40 seconds. Then an orderly appeared at the near end, escorting a patient in a standard-issue hospital gown. I recognized the orderly immediately. His name was Vincent Rowe. He had worked at Millridge for 9 years. Vincent guided the patient slowly down the corridor, one hand on the patient's shoulder, his posture calm and procedural. The patient moved without resistance. At the halfway point, another orderly entered the frame from the left, escorting a second patient. I recognized her as well. Her name was Dana Collier, a senior psychiatric attendant who had been with the facility since 2011. Both orderlies walked their patients toward the double doors at the far end. The footage continued for 2 minutes and 17 seconds. When the first orderly and patient reached the doors, Vincent pushed them open. Beyond the doors, the footage showed only white static, as though the camera feed terminated at the threshold. Vincent and the patient walked through. The doors swung shut. Dana and her patient followed 30 seconds later. The hallway was empty again. The file ended. I checked the metadata. The footage was labeled Camera D17, recorded November 2nd at 2:41 a.m. Duration 2 minutes 17 seconds. I pulled up the camera directory. Cameras D1 through D6 were listed and operational, covering the secure wing hallways, consultation rooms, and isolation observation areas. There was no D17. I opened the facility floor plan database and cross-referenced the secure wing layout. The wing contained 6 primary corridors, 3 consultation suites, 2 group therapy rooms, and 1 medication dispensary. No additional hallways, no 17th designation. I contacted the night systems technician, a man named Kyle Ashford, who managed camera diagnostics and server maintenance. I asked him if a new camera had been installed in the secure wing. He checked the installation logs. No new equipment had been installed in the past 6 months. I asked if a camera had been relabeled. He reviewed the directory. No changes had been logged. I sent him the footage file. He examined the metadata and said, "This is labeled as live captured and archived, but there's no corresponding camera input in the system. The file shouldn't exist." I asked if it could be archived footage from a decommissioned camera. He said all decommissioned equipment was wiped and repurposed, and that archived files were automatically purged after 3 years unless flagged for incident review. The footage showed recent activity. Vincent and Dana were both currently employed. I asked Kyle to pull up the staff assignment logs for November 2nd. Vincent had been scheduled in the observation wing from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Dana had been assigned to intake support. Neither had been scheduled in the secure wing. Neither should have been in that hallway. I called Vincent at home the following morning. I described the footage and asked if he had escorted a patient to the secure wing on November 2nd. He said he had not. I asked if he had walked through any hallway with double doors at the far end. He paused and said, "Tom, I don't remember anything like that." I worked observation that night. I didn't leave the wing. I called Dana. She gave the same answer. She had worked intake support, had not entered the secure wing, had not escorted any patients past midnight. I asked if she remembered Vincent being present anywhere in the facility that night. She said she did not recall seeing him. I reviewed the access logs for November 2nd. Vincent's badge had been used to unlock the observation wing at 9:54 p.m. He had badged out at 6:08 a.m. No other entries were recorded. Dana's badge had unlocked the intake wing at 9:41 p.m. She had badged out at 6:14 a.m. No entries into the secure wing were logged for either of them. I returned to the archive and opened the footage again. I froze the frame at 43 seconds and zoomed in on Vincent's badge, which was clipped to his belt. The number was visible, 8844. I cross-referenced the badge directory. 8844 was Vincent Rowe's assigned badge. I zoomed in on Dana's badge at 1 minute 9 seconds. Her number was 6621. Both were correct. I reviewed the footage a third time, this time focusing on the patients. The first patient was a woman in her mid-30s, her hair pulled back, her gait slow and medicated. I did not recognize her face. The second patient was a man in his late 40s, heavy-set, his head slightly bowed. I did not recognize him either. I pulled up the patient census for November 2nd. 37 individuals were housed in observation, intake, and secure treatment. I cross-referenced their intake photos with the footage. No matches. I escalated the issue to the facility director, a woman named Margaret Oswell, who had overseen Millridge operations for 12 years. I presented the footage, the floor plans, the access logs, and the staff interviews. She watched in silence. When the footage ended, she said, "This is a corrupted file. The system merged two separate recordings." I explained that the metadata showed a single continuous capture, that the camera label did not correspond to any installed equipment, and that the hallway did not exist in the facility layout. She said, "Then the label is wrong. The footage is from one of the 6 secure wing cameras. The system mislabeled it during upload." I played footage from cameras D1 through D6 side by side with the D17 file. None of the 6 hallways matched. The dimensions were different. The lighting placement was different. The door configuration was different. Margaret closed the file and said, "Tom, this is a technical error. Flag it for Kyle to investigate and move on." I flagged the file. Kyle examined it again and concluded that the footage was valid, but the label was corrupted, likely due to a server indexing error during archival upload. He suggested the footage had been captured by one of the secure wing cameras and mislabeled as D17 due to a metadata glitch. I asked him why the hallway did not match any of the existing secure wing corridors. He said camera angles and lens distortion could alter the appearance of familiar locations. I did not agree, but I archived the file under technical anomaly and continued my duties. On November 9th, I conducted another routine archive review. A second file labeled Hallway D17 appeared, dated November 8th at 2:41 a.m. I opened it. The footage was identical in structure to the first. The same hallway, the same lighting, the same double doors at the far end. This time, 4 patients were escorted by 3 orderlies. I recognized 2 of the orderlies, Marcus Flynn and Beth Holder. Both were currently employed. Both had been scheduled in different wings on November 8th. Both appeared calm and procedural, guiding their patients toward the doors at the far end. When the first pair reached the threshold, the doors opened, revealing the same white static. They walked through. The doors closed. The remaining patients followed. The file ended at 2 minutes 41 seconds. I reviewed the access logs. Neither Marcus nor Beth had entered the secure wing on November 8th. I reviewed the patient census. None of the patients in the footage matched current or recently discharged individuals. I called Marcus. He said he did not remember escorting anyone to a secure hallway with double doors. I called Beth. She said the same. I escalated the issue again. Margaret reviewed the second file and said, "Tom, this is the same corrupted footage. The system is duplicating a mislabeled file." I showed her the timestamp. The files were recorded 6 days apart. I showed her the differences in patient count, in orderly assignments, in positioning. She said, "Then the label is applying to 2 separate files from 2 separate cameras. Fix the labeling and close the issue." I did not close the issue. I began monitoring the archive every night, filtering specifically for the D17 label. On November 15th, a third file appeared, dated November 14th at 2:41 a.m. Same hallway, same doors, 6 patients, 4 orderlies. I recognized all 4 staff members. I called each one. None remembered the event. On November 21st, a 4th file appeared. Same hallway, same timestamp, 2:41 a.m. This time 8 patients, 5 orderlies. On November 27th, a 5th file appeared. 10 patients, 6 orderlies. The pattern was consistent, each file archived at 2:41 a.m. Each showed staff I recognized escorting patients I did not. Each ended with the patients walking through the double doors into static. On December 1st, I accessed the archive at 2:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the expected upload. I opened the live feed directory. Cameras D1 through D6 were active and streaming. No D17 feed appeared. At 2:41 a.m., I refreshed the directory. A live feed labeled Hallway D17 appeared. I opened it. The stream showed the same narrow corridor, the same fluorescent lighting, the same double doors. The hallway was empty. I watched for 3 minutes. No movement. At 2:44 a.m., the live feed cut to static. I refreshed the directory. The D17 feed was gone. I checked the archive. The footage had already uploaded, labeled December 1st, 2:41 a.m., duration 3 minutes, 12 seconds. I pulled up the facility blueprints and overlaid the security camera grid. I traced the sight lines for cameras D1 through D6, verifying their angles and coverage zones. None of them could produce the perspective shown in the D17 footage. I contacted the original construction firm that had designed the facility. I requested the archived architectural plans, including any abandoned or redesigned corridors. The firm sent digital scans of the original 2008 plans. I found a hallway labeled Secure Extension Corridor positioned between what would become D5 and D6. The corridor was 62 feet long, terminating in double doors leading to an unfinished expansion wing. The corridor had been removed from the final design due to budget constraints. It had never been built. The dimensions matched the footage exactly. I presented the findings to Margaret. I showed her the original blueprints, the overlay comparisons, the metadata consistency. I explained that the footage showed a hallway that had been planned but never constructed, and that staff were being documented escorting patients through a space that did not exist. She reviewed the materials in silence. Then she said, "Tom, this is archived footage from the construction phase. It's mislabeled and misfiled. There's no mystery here." I explained that the footage showed current staff in current uniforms escorting patients in current issue gowns. She said the footage was composited or corrupted. I asked why it appeared nightly at 2:41 a.m. She did not answer. I asked why the staff members shown had no memory of the events. She said I was overinterpreting technical glitches. I was instructed to stop reviewing the D17 files and to focus on operational priorities. I did not stop. I continued monitoring the archive. The files appeared every 6 days, always at 2:41 a.m. By late December, the patient count had increased to 14. By early January, it was 18. The orderlies remained calm. The patients remained compliant. And each time they reached the doors opened into static. On January 9th, I entered the secure wing at 2:35 a.m. I walked the length of D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, and D6. I checked every door, every junction, every branching corridor. I measured distances. I compared lighting placements. I found no hallway that matched the footage. At 2:40 a.m., I stood at the junction between D5 and D6. According to the original blueprints, the unbuilt secure extension corridor would have been located directly ahead. There was only a wall, painted pale green, seamless. I placed my hand on the surface. It was solid. I turned to leave. Behind me, I heard a door open. I turned back. The wall was still there, solid, uninterrupted, but I heard footsteps, muffled and rhythmic, moving away from me. I heard the soft murmur of voices, calm and procedural. I heard the faint metallic click of a badge reader, then silence. I checked my watch. 2:41 a.m. I returned to the security office and opened the archive. The footage had uploaded. January 9th, 2:41 a.m., hallway D17. 20 patients, 8 orderlies. I watched them walk calmly toward the double doors. When the first pair reached the threshold, the doors opened. Beyond them, the static flickered for one frame. In that frame, I saw another hallway, identical to the first, stretching into darkness. Then the static returned. The patients walked through. I have not reported the footage since January. I continue monitoring it nightly. The patient count increases, the orderlies remain calm, and every session ends the same way. They walk into static and the doors close behind them. The hallway is never empty when the footage ends. There are always more coming. Story 3, patient 0442 did not move. The patient had not moved in 11 days. No speech, no gesture, no eye contact. Catatonic. But when I synchronized the security footage with my session notes, the video showed her responding to questions I had not yet asked. Her body remained still, but her eyes tracked me across the room 3 seconds before I stood. Her head turned toward the door 4 seconds before I opened it. She was not reacting. She was anticipating. And when I asked her how she knew, she whispered, "Because I have already heard this." My name is Dr. Nathan Cross, and I am a licensed psychiatrist specializing in acute psychotic disorders and catatonic presentations. I have been employed at Millridge Behavioral Health for 9 years, conducting diagnostic evaluations, managing medication protocols, and overseeing treatment plans for patients in the secure observation wing. My work is procedural, evidence-based, and thoroughly documented. Each session is recorded via overhead security cameras installed in consultation rooms for legal protection, clinical review, and training purposes. I have conducted over 2,000 evaluations. I understand the boundaries between observation and interpretation. I understand the difference between patient behavior and my perception of it. On November 7th, I was assigned to evaluate a patient admitted under emergency psychiatric hold, following a dissociative episode. Her name was Jessica Renner. She was 34 years old, unemployed, with a documented history of schizoaffective disorder and 2 prior hospitalizations. She had been found unresponsive in her apartment by a wellness check, sitting motionless on her kitchen floor staring at a blank wall. Paramedics reported no response to verbal or physical stimuli. She was transported to Millridge and admitted to the observation wing under my care. When I first entered her room on November 7th at 10:15 a.m., Jessica was seated upright on the exam table, her hands resting flat on her thighs, her head tilted slightly downward, her eyes open but unfocused. I introduced myself. She did not respond. I asked her to acknowledge my presence by nodding or raising her hand. She did not move. I performed a standard neurological assessment, light reflex, motor response, verbal prompting. She exhibited no reaction. Her vitals were stable. Her pupils were reactive. But she remained completely still, her breathing shallow and rhythmic, her gaze fixed on a point approximately 3 feet in front of her. I diagnosed her presentation as catatonic stupor, likely exacerbated by medication non-compliance and environmental stressors. I prescribed a benzodiazepine challenge to assess responsiveness and scheduled follow-up evaluations every 12 hours. Over the next 4 days, Jessica's condition did not change. She did not speak. She did not move voluntarily. She did not make eye contact. Nursing staff reported that she required full assistance with hydration, feeding, and hygiene. She remained motionless during all interventions. On November 11th, I conducted my 4th evaluation. The session took place in Consultation Room 3, a small clinical space equipped with an exam table, 2 chairs, a desk, and a wall-mounted camera labeled Camera C9. The camera captured a wide-angle view of the room from the corner opposite the door, providing full visual documentation of patient and clinician interactions. I had used the room hundreds of times. I trusted its reliability. Jessica was brought to the room at 2:30 p.m. by 2 attendants. She was guided to the exam table and seated in the same upright posture she had maintained since admission. I sat in the chair across from her, approximately 4 feet away. I reviewed her chart, noted the lack of medication response, and began the evaluation. I asked her to state her name. No response. I asked her to identify the current date. No response. I asked her if she understood why she was here. No response. I documented her continued unresponsiveness and noted that her eyes, while open, did not track movement or focus on objects. At 2:47 p.m., I stood from my chair and crossed to the desk to retrieve a reflex hammer for a motor response test. As I turned back toward Jessica, I noticed her eyes had shifted. She was no longer staring at the wall. She was looking at the chair I'd just vacated. Her gaze was steady, focused, as though she were watching someone still seated there. I paused. I asked, "Jessica, can you hear me?" She did not respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty chair. I returned to my seat. Her gaze did not follow me. She continued staring at the space I had occupied moments earlier. I completed the session at 3:02 p.m. and documented the anomaly as possible delayed visual tracking, a symptom occasionally observed in catatonic patients. Jessica was returned to her observation room. I moved on to other evaluations. That evening, I reviewed the session footage from Camera C9 as part of my standard clinical documentation process. I opened the archived file, time-stamped November 11th, 2:30 p.m. to 3:02 p.m. The footage showed me entering the room, seating myself, and beginning the evaluation. Jessica sat motionless on the exam table, her posture rigid, her gaze unfocused. At 2:47 p.m., I stood and crossed to the desk. On screen, Jessica's eyes moved. They tracked me as I walked, following my movement across the room. Her head remained still, but her eyes shifted smoothly, deliberately maintaining focus on me. I froze the footage. In real time, I had not seen her eyes move. I had turned away to retrieve the reflex hammer. When I had looked back, her gaze had been fixed on the empty chair, but the footage showed her watching me. I rewound the clip and played it again. At 2:46 p.m., 31 seconds, I shifted in my chair, preparing to stand. On screen, Jessica's eyes moved first. They tracked to the desk before I stood. At 2:47 p.m., 4 seconds, I stood and walked to the desk. Her eyes followed me. At 2:47 p.m., 18 seconds, I turned back toward her. Her eyes remained on the desk. At 2:47 p.m., 22 seconds, I took one step toward the exam table. Her eyes moved back to the chair. She was not reacting to my movements. She was anticipating them. I reviewed the footage a third time, this time synchronizing it with my written session notes. At 2:39 p.m., I asked Jessica to state her name. On screen, her eyes shifted 3 seconds before I opened my mouth. At 2:41 p.m., I asked her to identify the date. Her eyes moved toward the calendar on the wall 2 seconds before I spoke. At 2:53 p.m., I stood to conclude the session. Her eyes tracked to the door 4 seconds before I moved. I documented the discrepancy and scheduled an additional evaluation for the following morning. On November 12th at 9:45 a.m., I returned to consultation room 3 with Jessica. I conducted the session methodically, announcing each action before I performed it to test her responsiveness. I said, "Jessica, I am going to stand now." I remained seated for 10 seconds. On screen, her eyes moved toward the door at the 5-second mark before I stood. I said, "I am going to walk to the desk." I remained still. Her eyes shifted to the desk 6 seconds later. I stood without announcement. Her eyes had already moved. I reviewed the footage immediately after the session. The pattern was consistent. Jessica's eye movements preceded my actions by 3 to 7 seconds. She was not responding to my verbal cues or physical movements. She was tracking events that had not yet occurred. I consulted with the facility neurologist, Dr. Paul Everett, and presented the footage. He suggested the appearance of anticipatory tracking could be explained by micro-movements or subconscious cues I was telegraphing before acting. I asked him to observe the next session in person. On November 13th at 11 a.m., Dr. Everett and I conducted a joint evaluation. I sat across from Jessica while Dr. Everett stood behind me out of her line of sight. I performed a series of unpredictable movements, standing without warning, crossing to the window, returning to my seat, moving toward the door, then stopping. Dr. Everett documented her eye movements in real time. After the session, we reviewed the footage together. Jessica's eyes had tracked every movement, shifting 3 to 6 seconds before I acted. Dr. Everett reviewed his notes. Her eye movements matched his observations, but his notes showed the movements occurring simultaneously with my actions, not before them. I synchronized the session footage with his written log. The timestamps did not align. According to the footage, Jessica's eyes moved at 11:07 a.m. 16 seconds. According to Dr. Everett's notes, I stood at 11:07 a.m., 19 seconds, a 3-second gap. I asked him if he had noticed her eyes moving before I stood. He said he had not. I showed him the footage. He watched in silence, then said, "Nathan, this is a codec error. The video is buffering ahead of the audio. It's displaying her reactions out of sync with your actions." I checked the metadata. The footage was labeled live capture, recorded in real time with synchronized audio. There was no buffering. There was no delay. I opened previous session files and compared timestamps. In every file, Jessica's eye movements preceded my actions by an average of 4.3 seconds. Dr. Everett suggested I was overanalyzing micro-expressions and subconscious behavioral cues. He recommended I continue standard treatment and stop reviewing the footage for anomalies. I did not stop. On November 15th, I conducted another session, this time without announcing my intent to Jessica or to myself. I entered the room, sat silently, and waited. Jessica remained motionless. At 11:23 a.m., her eyes moved to the door. At 11:23 a.m., 4 seconds later, an attendant knocked to deliver medication. At 11:31 a.m., her eyes moved to the desk. At 11:31 a.m., 6 seconds later, my pager vibrated. At 11:38 a.m., her eyes moved to the window. At 11:38 a.m., 5 seconds later, a maintenance worker passed by outside, visible through the glass. She was not responding to the present. She was perceiving the immediate future. I documented the findings and requested a neurology consult to assess for temporal lobe abnormalities, precognitive hallucination, or seizure activity. The consult was scheduled for November 18th. On November 17th at 3:15 p.m., I conducted an unscheduled session. I entered consultation room 3 without Jessica. I sat in the chair and reviewed her chart in silence. The room was empty. I remained alone for 11 minutes. At 3:22 p.m., I stood and left. That evening, I reviewed the security footage. At 3:18 p.m., camera C9 had captured me seated in the chair reviewing the chart. At 3:21 p.m., the camera captured me standing and crossing to the desk. But I had been seated until 3:22 p.m. I checked the timestamp. 3:21 p.m., November 17th. The footage showed me moving 1 minute before I had moved. I opened the live feed directory. Camera C9 was active and streaming in real time. I cross-referenced the archived file with my physical actions. The footage was not delayed, it was advanced. On November 18th, I entered consultation room 3 with Jessica at 10 a.m. I sat across from her and said, "Jessica, can you hear me?" Her eyes moved to my face. For the first time in 11 days, she made direct eye contact. Her expression remained neutral. She said, "Yes." I leaned forward. "How long have you been able to hear me?" She said, "Since the beginning." I asked, "Why didn't you respond?" She said, "Because I have already heard this." I paused. "What do you mean?" She said, "You asked me this question yesterday. You will ask me again tomorrow. You have asked me 11 times. I checked my notes. I had not asked her that question before. I said, "Jessica, this is the first time I've asked you this." She said, "For you." I opened my session log on the desk computer and pulled up the archived footage from the past 11 days. I played the files in sequence. In each session, at the exact moment I concluded the evaluation and prepared to leave, Jessica's lips moved. There was no audio. Her lips moved silently, forming words I had not heard. I isolated the frames and cross-referenced them with lip-reading analysis software. In every session, she had mouthed the same sentence, "You will ask me tomorrow." I returned my attention to Jessica. "What happens tomorrow?" She said, "You already know." I asked her, "Do I ask you the same questions?" She said, "You ask me why I know, you ask me how I see it, you ask me if I can stop it." I said, "Can you?" She said, "No." I asked her, "Why not?" She said, "Because it has already happened." I reviewed the footage from that session later that evening. At 10:06 a.m., I asked Jessica, "What happens tomorrow?" On screen, her mouth moved 4 seconds earlier. She had answered the question before I asked it. At 10:09 a.m., I asked her, "Can you stop it?" She had mouthed the word "no" 6 seconds before I spoke. On November 19th, I conducted another session. I did not prepare questions in advance. I entered the room and sat in silence. Jessica remained motionless. At 10:32 a.m., she said, "You are going to ask me about the camera." I had not decided to ask about the camera. But I said, "What about it?" She said, "It is recording this before you say it." I checked the live feed. Camera C9 was streaming in real time. I asked, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I can see it." I asked, "See what?" She said, "What you will do next." I said, "From what will I do?" She said, "You will stand. You will walk to the door. You will turn back and ask me why I did not tell you sooner." I remained seated. I did not move. At 10:34 a.m., I stood. I walked to the door. I turned back and said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She said, "I did." I reviewed the footage. At 10:33 a.m., 51 seconds, Jessica had said, "I did." At 10:34 a.m., 12 seconds, I had asked the question. She had answered 21 seconds before I spoke. I have continued evaluating Jessica daily. She remains catatonic in her observation room, unresponsive to nursing staff, unresponsive to medication. But in consultation room 3, she speaks. She answers questions before I ask them. She describes actions before I perform them. She recounts sessions I have not yet conducted. The footage shows her responding in real time, but the timestamps show her responding in advance. On December 2nd, I asked her when this began. She said, "It has always been this way." I asked, "For how long?" She said, "Since before I arrived." I asked, "Do you see everything before it happens?" She said, "Only in this room." I asked, "Why this room?" She said, "Because the camera is watching." I have stopped reviewing the footage. I continue conducting sessions. Jessica continues answering before I ask, and the footage continues archiving events that have not yet occurred. Some sessions I remember, some sessions I do not. But the camera records them all, and Jessica sees them first. Story 4. The technician who watched himself leave. I watched myself badge out of the facility at 2:11 a.m. The surveillance feed showed me walking calmly through the exit corridor, scanning my credentials and pushing through the secure door into the parking lot. But I was seated in the control room at 2:11 a.m., staring at the monitor, watching myself leave. The access log confirmed both events. 2 identical timestamps, 2 identical badge scans. The system closed the incident automatically and flagged it as resolved. My name is Eric Lang, and I have been the surveillance systems technician at Millridge Behavioral Health for 7 years. My responsibilities include maintaining camera functionality, diagnosing feed errors, managing server uptime, correcting timestamp drift, and ensuring archived footage remains compliant with legal retention standards. I work the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Monday through Friday. The facility is quieter at night. Fewer staff, fewer incidents, fewer distractions. I prefer it. I know the rhythm of the building after dark. I know which cameras flicker under fluorescent interference, which feeds lag during server backups, which motion sensors trigger false alerts in empty hallways. I know the system because I built it. I installed 43 of the 47 cameras currently operational. I configured the digital archive. I programmed the redundancy protocols. The system does not malfunction, and when it does, I know why. On the night of December 4th, I arrived at the facility at 9:53 p.m. and badged into the security wing. I crossed through the main corridor, unlocked the surveillance control room, and logged into the monitoring station. The control room is a small, windowless office located on the first floor adjacent to the main security desk. It contains 6 monitors, 2 server racks, 1 workstation, and a backup power terminal. The room is climate-controlled, sound-insulated, and locked at all times except during my shift. I am the only technician authorized to access it overnight. I began the evening's diagnostics at 10:07 p.m. I ran a server integrity check, verified camera feed consistency, reviewed the previous night's archived footage for corrupted files, and updated the timestamp synchronization across all 47 cameras. Everything was operational. At 11:41 p.m., I received an automated alert from the access control system indicating a badge scan anomaly in the East Wing. I opened the access log. The alert was minor. A single badge had scanned twice within 3 seconds at the same door, likely caused by a staff member swiping their credentials multiple times due to reader lag. I cleared the alert and returned to diagnostics. At 1:32 a.m., I took a break. I left the control room, walked to the staff lounge, poured coffee, and returned by 1:41 a.m. I resumed monitoring. The facility was quiet. No incidents, no alerts, no camera malfunctions. At 2:09 a.m., I stood from the workstation to stretch. I had been seated for over 3 hours. My back ached. I walked to the corner of the room, rolled my shoulders, and returned to the desk. I sat down. I opened the live feed directory to check camera A4. which had been experiencing minor pixelation earlier in the week. The feed was clear. At 2:11 a.m., Monitor 3, which displayed the live feed from the exit corridor camera, showed movement. I glanced at the screen. A figure was walking toward the exit doors, moving calmly, badge in hand. I recognized the posture immediately. It was mine. I was watching myself on the monitor. I was walking through the exit corridor, approaching the badge reader, extending my credentials toward the scanner. I was seated at the desk. I was also on screen. I stared at the monitor. The figure on screen reached the badge reader, scanned the credentials, and pushed through the secure door. The timestamp on the feed read 2:11 a.m. December 4th. I checked my watch. 2:11 a.m. I looked down at my desk. My badge was clipped to my belt. I checked the access log. A new entry appeared. Badge number 7392, exit corridor, scanned at 2:11 a.m. 7392 was my badge number. I was still seated in the control room. I stood from the chair and crossed to the door. I opened it and stepped into the hallway. The corridor was empty. I walked to the exit hallway and checked the secure door. It was locked. I scanned my badge. The reader beeped. The door unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the parking lot. The lot was empty except for my car, parked in the same spot I had left it at 9:53 p.m. I returned inside, relocked the door, and walked back to the control room. I sat at the workstation and reviewed the footage from the exit corridor camera. I rewound the feed to 2:10 a.m. and played it forward. At 2:11 a.m. 6 seconds, a figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, walking toward the exit. The figure was wearing my uniform: black pants, gray technician's jacket, facility ID badge clipped to the belt. The build was identical. The posture was identical. The gait was identical. At 2:11 a.m. 19 seconds, the figure reached the badge reader and extended the credentials. I froze the frame and zoomed in. The badge number was visible: 7392. At 2:11 a.m. 23 seconds, the door opened. The figure walked through. The door closed. The hallway was empty. I checked the access log again. 2 entries were now listed for 2:11 a.m. The first entry read, badge number 7392, exit corridor, scanned at 2:11 a.m. 12 seconds. The second entry read, badge number 7392, control room door, scanned at 2:11 a.m. 12 seconds. I had not scanned my badge at the control room door. I had been seated inside. I pulled up the footage from the hallway camera outside the control room. At 2:11 a.m. 12 seconds, the control room door opened from the inside. A figure stepped out, walked down the hallway, and turned toward the exit corridor. The figure was me. I had not left the control room at 2:11 a.m. I had been seated at the desk watching Monitor 3, but the footage showed me leaving. The access log confirmed I had scanned my badge at the control room door. Both events were time-stamped identically. Both were archived as verified. I filed an incident report through the facility's automated system, flagging the access log discrepancy and the duplicate footage. The system processed the report, cross-referenced the entries, and returned a response within 40 seconds. Incident resolved. No further action required. I opened the resolution summary. The system had categorized the incident as a badge scan duplication caused by reader feedback error and had merged the 2 entries into a single verified event. According to the summary, I had badged out of the facility at 2:11 a.m. and the duplicate entry had been automatically corrected. But I had not badged out. I was still inside. I checked the live feed directory. My badge was listed as active, on site. I checked the access log again. My badge was listed as scanned out at 2:11 a.m. I escalated the issue to the night security supervisor, a man named Gerald Pritchard. I called him at 2:34 a.m. and described the incident. He accessed the footage remotely and reviewed the exit corridor camera feed. After 3 minutes, he said, "Eric, the footage shows you leaving at 2:11. Your badge scanned out. You're listed as off-site." I said, "I'm in the control room right now. I never left." He said, "Then how did your badge scan at the exit?" I said, "I don't know. That's why I'm calling." He paused. "Eric, are you sure you didn't step out for a break and forget?" I said, "I've been seated at the workstation since 1:41. I didn't leave the control room." He said, "The log says otherwise, and the footage confirms it. If you're still on site, scan your badge at the control room door and I'll verify the entry." I walked to the control room door, opened it, stepped into the hallway, and scanned my badge at the reader mounted on the wall. The reader beeped. The system logged the entry. Badge number 7392, control room door, scanned at 2:36 a.m. I returned to the workstation. Gerald confirmed the scan and said, "Okay, you're logged as on site now. The earlier scan was probably a feedback loop. The reader registered your badge twice. It happens." I said, "The footage shows me walking out." He said, the footage shows someone walking out. If the camera angle is narrow and the lighting is dim, it can misidentify staff from a distance. You probably saw someone else and assumed it was you." I said, "I zoomed in on the badge. It was mine." He said, "Then the badge number was misread by the camera. Eric, the system flagged it as resolved. Drop it." I did not drop it. I reviewed the footage frame by frame. At 2:11 a.m., 19 seconds, the figure extended the badge toward the reader. The number was clear, 7392. At 2:11 a.m., 21 seconds, the figure's face was partially visible as it turned toward the camera. I isolated the frame and enhanced the image. The face was mine. The features were identical. Hairline, jaw structure, glasses, the small scar on my left temple from a childhood fall. It was not someone else. It was me. Over the following week, I monitored the exit corridor camera every night. On December 9th at 1:53 a.m., the figure appeared again. Same uniform, same posture, same badge. It walked calmly to the exit, scanned the credentials, and left. I was seated in the control room. The access log recorded the scan. The system flagged it as resolved. On December 14th at 2:31 a.m., the figure appeared again. On December 19th at 1:44 a.m., it appeared again. Each time I was inside the facility. Each time. The footage showed me leaving. Each time the access log recorded 2 identical scans. Each time the system merged the entries and closed the incident. On December 22nd, I accessed the archived footage from the control room hallway camera and synchronized it with the exit corridor footage. At 1:47 a.m., the control room door opened. I stepped out. I walked down the hallway toward the exit. At 1:49 a.m., I reached the exit corridor. At 1:50 a.m., I scanned my badge and left. But I was seated in the control room at 1:47 a.m. I had not moved. I checked the live feed from the control room. The workstation was empty, the chair was vacant, I was not visible on screen. I stood and crossed to the doorway. I opened the door and looked into the hallway. It was empty. I returned to the workstation. The live feed still showed an empty room. I reviewed the footage from the control room camera. At 1:46 a.m., 53 seconds, I stood from the chair. At 1:47 a.m., 2 seconds, I walked to the door. At 1:47 a.m., 9 seconds, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. But I had not stood at 1:46 a.m. I had remained seated. I checked the timestamp on my workstation computer, 1:51 a.m. I checked the timestamp on the archived footage, 1:47 a.m. A 4-minute gap. I filed another incident report. The system processed it and returned the same response. Incident resolved. No further action required. I called Gerald. He reviewed the footage and said, Eric, you need to take a break. You're seeing yourself on every camera. You're logging ghost scans. You're reporting incidents that don't exist. Take a week off. I said, Omelt. The footage is archived. It's time-stamped. It's verified. He said, the footage shows you doing your job. Walking the facility, checking doors. You're overanalyzing your own routine and turning it into a technical issue. You need rest. I did not take a week off. On December 28th, I conducted an experiment. I remained seated at the workstation from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I did not leave the control room. I did not stand. I did not walk to the door. At 2:19 a.m., the exit corridor camera showed me walking toward the exit. At 2:21 a.m., I scanned my badge and left. The access log recorded the scan. The system flagged it as resolved. On January 3rd, I accessed the archived footage from every camera in the facility and filtered for my appearance. I found 37 instances of myself walking through hallways, entering rooms, and exiting the building during shifts when I had remained in the control room. In each instance, the footage was time-stamped within minutes of real time. In each instance, the access log confirmed my presence in 2 locations simultaneously. In each instance, the system merged the entries and closed the incident. On January 8th, I reviewed the footage from the control room camera in real time. At 2:41 a.m., I stood from the chair. I watched myself stand on the monitor. I was still seated. On screen, I walked to the door. I remained in the chair. On screen, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. I looked at the door. It was closed. I stood and walked to it. I opened it. The hallway was empty. I returned to the workstation. The monitor showed an empty control room. I was not visible on screen. I checked the timestamp. 2:43 a.m. I checked the archived footage. At 2:41 a.m. I had stood. At 2:42 a.m. I had left the room. At 2:43 a.m. I had scanned my badge at the exit. I was still inside, but the system had logged me as gone, and the footage had archived my departure before I moved. I no longer file incident reports. I no longer call Gerald. I remain seated at the workstation every night, monitoring the feeds, running diagnostics, watching the cameras, and every night at some point between midnight and 3 a.m., I watch myself leave. The figure walks calmly through the exit corridor, scans my badge, and steps into the parking lot. The system logs the departure, the footage archives, and I remain here, seated in the control room, watching the monitors. I do not know when I started leaving. I do not know when I will stop. But the footage continues, and the system continues closing the incidents, merging the entries, confirming both events as verified. Some nights I wonder which version of me is real, the one seated in the control room watching the screens, or the one walking calmly toward the exit, scanning the badge, stepping into the lot. The system does not distinguish. It logs both. It archives both, and it resolves both automatically, without question, without error, without end. Story 5. Unauthorized presence detected. The alert was routine. Motion detected in Ward C, Room 14. The ward had been empty since midnight. I accessed the camera feed. A patient stood motionless in the center of the room, her wrists restrained, her gaze fixed on the lens. I checked the restraint log. Her restraints had been removed 40 minutes earlier. I zoomed in on her face. The system flagged her identity as staff, not patient. It attached my name, my credentials, my badge photo. She was still staring at the camera. My name is Claire Hollis, and I have been a night shift charge nurse at Millridge Behavioral Health for 8 years. My responsibilities include patient observation, medication administration, incident documentation, and response coordination for the overnight clinical staff. I oversee Ward C, a 16-bed observation unit housing patients under acute psychiatric care. The ward operates under strict monitoring protocols. Every room is equipped with a wall-mounted camera, Every patient is logged hourly. Every movement is tracked. I know the ward by routine and by instinct. I know which patients pace at night, which resist medication, which require restraint intervention. I know the rhythm of the building between midnight and 6 a.m. I know when something is wrong. On the night of January 9th, I clocked in at 11:47 p.m. and received handoff from the evening charge nurse, a woman named Sandra Purcell. She briefed me on the 16 patients currently housed in Ward C. 15 were stable. One, a 38-year-old woman named Monica Trell, had been placed in 4-point restraints at 9:32 p.m. following an aggressive outburst during group therapy. Sandra noted that Monica had been calm since 10:15 p.m. and that the restraints were scheduled for removal at midnight pending my assessment. I acknowledged the handoff and began my rounds. At midnight 04 a.m. I entered room 14 where Monica was housed. She was lying on the exam table, her wrists and ankles secured by padded cuffs attached to the bed frame. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was even. I performed a standard assessment, circulation check, skin integrity review, verbal responsiveness test. Monica did not respond. I documented her as calm and cooperative. I consulted with the attending physician via secure message and received authorization to remove the restraints. At midnight 17 a.m. I unlocked the cuffs. Monica remained motionless. I instructed her to rest and exited the room. At 12:53 a.m. I was seated at the nurse's station updating patient charts when the security alert system chimed. A notification appeared on my monitor. Motion detected. Ward C, room 14. I checked the patient log. Room 14 was occupied by Monica Trell. I checked the observation notes. Monica had been logged as resting at midnight 41 a.m. by the floor attendant. I opened the live camera feed for room 14. The room was dim, lit only by the safety light above the door. A figure stood in the center of the room, motionless, facing the camera. The figure was wearing a hospital gown. Her arms hung at her sides. Her posture was rigid. I zoomed in. It was Monica, but the restraint log confirmed I had removed her cuffs at midnight 17 a.m. I checked the live feed timestamp, 12:53 a.m., January 9th. I radioed the floor attendant, a man named Kevin Moss, and asked him to check room 14 in person. Kevin responded within 90 seconds. Room 14 is clear. Patient is in bed resting, no movement. I stared at the monitor. The live feed still showed Monica standing in the center of the room. I said, Kevin, I'm looking at the camera feed right now. She's standing in the middle of the room. Kevin paused. Claire, I'm standing in the doorway. She's lying down. She hasn't moved. I switched to the hallway camera outside room 14. The feed showed Kevin standing in the open doorway, looking into the room. I switched back to the room 14 camera. Monica was still standing, facing the lens. I said, Kevin, step into the room and stand next to her. Kevin entered the room. On the hallway feed, I watched him walk to the bed and stand beside it. On the room 14 feed, Monica remained standing in the center of the room. Kevin was not visible. I said, Kevin, wave your hand. On the hallway feed, Kevin raised his hand and waved. On the room 14 feed, nothing changed. Monica stood motionless. I said, Kevin, the camera isn't showing you. It's only showing Monica, and she's standing. Kevin said, Claire, she's not standing. She's in bed. I'm looking right at her. I closed the feed and accessed the archived footage from room 14. I rewound to midnight 17 a.m. when I had removed Monica's restraints. The footage showed me unlocking the cuffs, stepping back and exiting the room. Monica remained on the bed. At midnight 19 a.m., Monica sat up. At midnight 22 a.m., she stood. At midnight 24 a.m., she walked to the center of the room and stopped. She faced the camera. She remained motionless. The footage continued through 12:53 a.m. Monica did not move. I called Kevin back to the nurse's station and showed him the archived footage. He watched in silence. When it ended, he said, "Claire, that's not what I saw. When I walked into the room, she was lying on the bed. She didn't stand up. She didn't move." I said, "The camera shows her standing for the past 30 minutes. Kevin said, "Then the camera is wrong." I accessed the live feed again. Monica was still standing in the center of the room facing the camera. I decided to verify the situation myself. I walked to room 14 and opened the door. Monica was lying on the bed, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. I stepped into the room and crossed to the bed. I checked her pulse. Normal. I checked her position. She had not moved since I had removed the restraints. I returned to the nurse's station and checked the live feed. The monitor still showed Monica standing in the center of the room. I contacted the night systems technician, Eric Lang, and reported the camera malfunction. He accessed the feed remotely and said, "Claire, the camera is functioning. I'm seeing the same feed you are. Patient standing, center of the room, facing the camera. No malfunction detected." I said, "Eric, I just walked into the room. She's lying on the bed. She hasn't moved." He said, "Then the feed is buffering old footage. I'll reset the camera." The feed cut to static. 3 seconds later, it resumed. Monica was still standing in the center of the room. Eric said, "Feed is live. Reset complete. If the issue persists, I'll need to physically inspect the camera." I said, "Eric, she's not standing. I'm telling you, she's lying on the bed." He said, "Claire, I'm looking at a live feed time-stamped at 1:14 a.m. The patient is standing. If she's not standing when you look in the room, then you're experiencing a perception delay, but the camera doesn't lie." I ended the call. I returned to room 14. Monica was still lying on the bed. I stood in the doorway and looked at her. She had not moved. I pulled out my phone and accessed the facility's mobile surveillance app. I opened the live feed for room 14. On my phone, Monica was standing in the center of the room. I looked up. She was lying on the bed. I looked at my phone. She was standing facing the camera. I stepped into the room. On my phone, Monica remained standing. In the room, she remained lying down. I closed the app. I walked back to the nurse's station and reviewed the footage again. At 1:17 a.m., Monica was still standing. I fast-forwarded. At 1:31 a.m., she remained standing. At 1:48 a.m., she remained standing. At 2:03 a.m., I checked the room in person again. She was lying on the bed, asleep. I checked the live feed. She was standing. At 2:26 a.m., I opened the patient identity verification system and cross-referenced Monica's face with the footage. The system analyzed the image and returned a result. Identity match. Staff. The system flagged the figure in the footage as a staff member, not a patient. I checked the personnel match. The system displayed my name. Claire Hollis, charge nurse, badge number 6621. I stared at the screen. The figure in the footage was Monica Trell, patient, age 38, admitted January 7th. But the system identified her as me. I ran the verification again. The system returned the same result. I accessed the facial recognition log. The figure's biometric markers matched my personnel file, facial geometry, iris pattern, height, build. I checked the personnel database. My photo appeared on screen. I compared it to the footage. The figure in the room did not resemble me. The build was different. The height was different. The facial structure was different. But the system confirmed a match. I contacted the facility IT administrator, a man named Aaron Brinker, and reported the identification error. He accessed the system remotely and reviewed the verification log. After several minutes, he said, "Claire, the system is functioning correctly. The biometric match is verified. The figure in the footage is flagged as you." I said, "Aaron, that's not me. That's Monica Trell. She's a patient." He said, "The system cross-referenced the footage with all personnel and patient files. The match returned your credentials. If you're seeing someone else in the footage, then there's a visual discrepancy between what the camera captured and what the system logged." I said, "How is that possible?" He said, "It's not. The system doesn't create false matches. If it flagged you, then the biometric data in the footage corresponds to your file." I ended the call. I returned to room 14. Monica was lying on the bed. I checked the live feed. The figure was standing in the center of the room facing the camera. I zoomed in on the face. The system overlay appeared on screen, highlighting facial landmarks and displaying my name. I checked the timestamp, 2:47 a.m., January 9th. I checked my watch. 2:47 a.m. I was standing at the nurse's station. The figure in the footage was standing in room 14. The system identified both as me. Over the following nights, I monitored room 14 continuously. Monica remained in bed. The live feed showed the figure standing in the center of the room. At 3:18 a.m. on January 10th, the figure moved. She turned slowly toward the door, her gaze fixed on the exit. At 3:19 a.m., she walked to the door and stopped. She did not open it. She stood motionless, facing the doorway. At 3:21 a.m., I walked to room 14 and opened the door. Monica was lying on the bed. I checked the live feed. The figure was standing at the door, facing the camera. I stepped into the room. The figure on the feed did not move. I walked to the center of the room. The figure remained at the door. I waved my hand. The figure did not react. I exited the room. The figure remained at the door. On January 12th, I reviewed the archived footage from room 14 and synchronized it with my hourly rounds log. At 12:34 a.m., I had entered room 14 to perform a visual check. The footage showed me opening the door, stepping into the room, crossing to the bed and checking Monica's vitals. But the figure standing in the center of the room did not move. She remained motionless, facing the camera as I performed the check. I appeared twice in the footage, once performing the check, once standing motionless in the center of the room. The system flagged both as me. On January 15th, Monica was discharged. Room 14 was cleaned and prepared for the next admission. I checked the live feed. The room was empty. At 11:41 p.m., a new patient was admitted to room 14. His name was David Locke, a 42-year-old man brought in following a manic episode. I escorted him to the room and completed the intake assessment. At midnight 09 a.m., I exited the room. I checked the live feed. The figure was standing in the center of the room facing the camera. The system flagged the figure as me. I accessed the personnel verification system and ran a biometric scan of the figure. The system confirmed the match. Claire Hollis, charge nurse, badge number 6621. I checked the room in person. David was lying on the bed, resting. The figure on the feed remained standing. I asked the attending physician to review the footage. He watched in silence and said, "Claire, the camera is malfunctioning. File a maintenance request." I filed the request. Eric inspected the camera on January 17th. He tested the lens, verified the feed integrity, and confirmed the system was operational. He said, "Claire, there's no malfunction. The camera is capturing what's in the room." I said, "Then why does the system identify the patient as me?" He said, "That's not a camera issue. That's a database issue. Contact IT." I contacted Aaron. He reviewed the verification log again and said, "Claire, the system is identifying the biometric data correctly. If the figure in the footage matches your file, then the data is accurate." I said, "Aaron, I'm not in that room. I'm standing at the nurse's station." He said, then the system is logging 2 instances of your biometric data simultaneously. That's not possible unless you're in 2 locations at once. I said, I'm not. He said, then the data is corrupted, but the system doesn't show corruption, it shows verified matches. I have stopped checking the room in person. I have stopped reviewing the footage. I continue my rounds. I continue documenting patients. I continue monitoring the ward. But every night when I access the live feed for room 14, the figure is standing in the center of the room facing the camera. The system identifies her as me, and every night the figure stands a little closer to the door. She does not move quickly. She does not move suddenly, but she moves. And the system continues logging her presence as mine. I do not know when she will reach the door. I do not know what will happen when she does. But the footage continues, and the system continues confirming that the figure in the room is me. Some nights I check my reflection in the glass at the nurse's station. I see myself clearly. But I wonder if the camera sees someone else, or if I have been standing in room 14 all along, staring at the lens, waiting for myself to notice. Story 6. The final archive review. Before the facility closed, I authorized a full export of the surveillance archive. 46,000 hours of footage spanning 11 years of operations. I reviewed the final compilation in my office on March 19th. The footage ended with a locked file labeled Post-Discharge Monitoring. I opened it. The timestamp read March 23rd, 4 days in the future. The footage showed my office, the lights on, the desk occupied. I was seated in my chair, reviewing files, answering calls, conducting meetings. But I had scheduled my final day for March 22nd. The footage continued past my departure. My name is Dr. Helen Morse, and I have been the medical director of Millridge Behavioral Health for 11 years. My responsibilities include clinical oversight, regulatory compliance, staff supervision, and facility administration. I have managed treatment protocols, coordinated accreditation reviews, and ensured that every patient admitted to Millridge received evidence-based psychiatric care. I have reviewed thousands of case files, attended hundreds of administrative hearings, and signed off on every major operational decision since 2014. I know this facility. I know its strengths, its limitations, its history. And I know when it is time to close. On February 7th, the hospital board voted to cease operations at Millridge Behavioral Health effective March 31st. The decision was financial, not clinical. Declining insurance reimbursements, rising operational costs, and competition from newer facilities had rendered Millridge unsustainable. I was tasked with coordinating the closure, patient transfers, staff reassignments, record archiving, equipment liquidation. It was procedural, it was necessary, it was final. As part of the closure protocol, I authorized a comprehensive export of the facility's digital surveillance archive. The archive contained 46,214 hours of recorded footage spanning 11 years of operations, captured across 47 cameras and stored on redundant servers in the facility's secure control room. The export was required by state regulation to preserve documentation for potential legal review, accreditation audits, and incident investigations. The process was scheduled to begin on March 1st and conclude by March 15th, with the final compiled archive delivered to an off-site secure storage provider by March 20th. On March 12th, I received a status update from Eric Lang, the facility's surveillance systems technician. He reported that the archive export was 92% complete, with an estimated completion date of March 14th. He noted no corrupted files, no missing footage, and no system errors. I acknowledged the update and continued coordinating the remaining closure tasks. On March 16th, Eric delivered the completed archive to my office on 3 external hard drives, each containing a segmented backup of the full surveillance record. He confirmed that all footage had been verified, indexed, and encrypted according to regulatory standards. On March 19th, I scheduled time to review the archive personally before authorizing its transfer to off-site storage. I wanted to ensure the export was complete, that no critical incident footage had been omitted, and that the archive met the legal retention requirements. I opened the first hard drive and accessed the directory. The archive was organized chronologically by camera, beginning with the facility's opening day in 2014 and extending through March 15, 2025. I reviewed a random sampling of files from each year, verifying timestamps, video quality, and metadata accuracy. Everything was in order. At 4:37 p.m., I opened the final subdirectory labeled Archive Compilation, March 2025. The folder contained a single video file, final reviewed MP4. The file size was unusually large, 18.6 gigabytes. I opened it. The video began with a black screen and a title card. Millridge Behavioral Health, Final Archive Review, compiled March 15, 2025. The title faded. The footage began. The video was a montage, a chronological sequence of significant events captured by the facility's cameras over 11 years. I watched patient admissions, staff interactions, emergency interventions, therapy sessions, administrative meetings. The footage was edited seamlessly, transitioning from one scene to the next without abrupt cuts. I recognized many of the events. I had been present for some of them. I had signed off on others. The compilation was thorough, professional, and procedurally sound. At 1 hour and 43 minutes, the footage transitioned to recent events. I saw myself in my office, conducting meetings, reviewing files, speaking with staff. The footage was time-stamped February through early March. I watched myself coordinate the closure, assign patient transfers, and finalize administrative paperwork. The footage felt familiar. I remembered these moments. At 2 hours and 11 minutes, the footage showed my office on March 15th at 3:22 p.m. I was seated at my desk, reviewing the archive export status report Eric had sent earlier that day. I watched myself read the report, acknowledge it via email, and return to reviewing patient transfer documentation. The footage was accurate. At 2 hours and 14 minutes, the footage continued. The timestamp advanced to March 16th, 9:41 a.m. I was seated at my desk, reviewing closure checklists. I watched myself make phone calls, respond to emails, and update administrative logs. I remembered that day. It had been routine. The footage was correct. At 2 hours and 19 minutes, the timestamp advanced to March 17th, 10:15 a.m. I was in my office meeting with the facility's legal counsel to finalize closure documentation. I remembered the meeting. The footage was accurate. At 2 hours and 23 minutes, the timestamp advanced to March 19th, 4:37 p.m. I was seated at my desk, watching the archive compilation on my computer. I froze. I was watching myself watch the footage. The video showed me from the perspective of the wall-mounted camera in my office, camera A12. I watched myself lean forward, staring at my computer screen, reviewing the archive. I checked the timestamp on the footage. March 19th, 4:37 p.m. I checked my watch. 4:41 p.m. The footage I was watching had been recorded 4 minutes earlier. It was showing me reviewing the archive I was currently reviewing. I paused the video. I checked the file metadata. The file was labeled as compiled on March 15th, but the footage included events from March 19th, 4 days after the compilation date. I resumed playback. The footage continued. I watched myself pause the video, check the metadata, and resume playback. I was watching a recording of myself performing the exact actions I was currently performing. The footage was synchronized with my movements in real time, but the timestamp indicated it had been recorded and archived 4 minutes earlier. At 2 hours and 26 minutes, the footage advanced further. The timestamp read March 19th, 5:03 p.m. I was still seated at my desk, watching the archive, but I had not yet reached 5:03 p.m. I was at 4:43 p.m. The footage was showing events that had not yet occurred. I watched myself close the video file, stand from my desk, and walk to the door. I glanced at my watch. 4:43 p.m. On screen, I opened the door and exited my office at 5:03 p.m. The footage continued. The timestamp advanced to 5:17 p.m. My office was empty. I paused the video again. I checked the timestamp on my computer. 4:44 p.m. The footage was showing my office 23 minutes in the future. I resumed playback. The footage continued past 5:17 p.m. The timestamp advanced to 6:32 p.m. My office remained empty, the lights still on, the desk unoccupied. At 7:41 p.m., the door opened. I entered the office carrying a folder. I crossed to my desk, sat down, and began reviewing documents. I watched myself work for 11 minutes. At 7:52 p.m., I stood, exited the office, and turned off the lights. The footage continued. The timestamp advanced to March 20th, 8:15 a.m. The footage showed my office. The lights were on. I was seated at my desk reviewing files. But March 20th had not yet occurred. It was currently March 19th, 4:46 p.m. The footage was showing events that would take place 16 hours in the future. I watched myself conduct meetings, make phone calls, and coordinate final patient transfers. The footage continued through the morning and into the afternoon. At 2:31 p.m. on March 20th, I stood from my desk and walked to the window. I stared out at the parking lot for 4 minutes. Then I returned to my desk and resumed working. The footage continued. At 2 hours and 59 minutes, the timestamp advanced to March 22nd, 11:47 a.m. March 22nd was my scheduled final day. I had planned to complete the closure documentation, conduct a final facility walkthrough, and depart by 3 p.m. The footage showed me seated at my desk, reviewing files. I watched myself work through the afternoon. At 2:53 p.m., I stood, gathered my belongings, and walked to the door. I paused in the doorway, looking back at the office. Then I exited and closed the door. The footage continued. The timestamp advanced to 3:31 p.m. My office was empty. The lights were off. At 3 hours and 7 minutes, the footage continued. The timestamp advanced to March 23rd, 9:22 a.m. My office lights were on. I was seated at my desk, but I was scheduled to depart on March 22nd. I should not have been in the office on March 23rd. I watched myself review files, answer phone calls, and respond to emails. The footage showed me working through the morning, attending meetings, and coordinating tasks. I appeared calm, focused, procedural. The footage. The continued through the afternoon. At 4:41 p.m. on March 23rd, I was still seated at my desk, reviewing documents. At 3 hours and 23 minutes, the timestamp advanced to March 25th. I was still in my office. The facility closure had been completed on March 22nd. Staff had been reassigned. Patients had been transferred. The building was scheduled to be vacated by March 24th. But the footage showed me working at my desk, conducting meetings, making phone calls. I appeared unaware that the facility had closed. At 3 hours and 38 minutes, the timestamp advanced to March 27th. I was still in my office. At 3 hours and 51 minutes, the timestamp advanced to April 2nd. I was still working. At 4 hours and 9 minutes, the timestamp advanced to April 10th. My office was still occupied. The lights were still on. I was still seated at my desk, reviewing files, attending meetings, coordinating tasks that no longer existed. The footage continued. April 15th, April 22nd, April 29th. I was still there. The footage showed me moving through my daily routine without variation, without awareness, without end. At 4 hours and 47 minutes, the timestamp advanced to May 6th. I was still working. At 5 hours and 12 minutes, the timestamp advanced to May 20th. I was still there. The footage continued for 6 hours and 34 minutes. The final timestamp read June 18th, 3:47 p.m. I was seated at my desk reviewing a file, the same posture I had maintained for months. The footage ended abruptly. The screen went black. A message appeared, "End of archive, final file locked." I sat in silence, staring at the screen. I checked my watch. 4:51 p.m., March 19th. I checked the file metadata again. The file was labeled as compiled on March 15th, but the footage extended through June 18th, 3 months beyond the compilation date, 2 months beyond the facility closure. I closed the file and accessed the archive directory. I searched for the file labeled finalreview.mp4. It was not listed. I searched the entire archive. No file matched. The video I had just watched did not exist in the directory. I called Eric and asked if he had included a compilation file in the final archive export. He said he had not. I described the file. Finalreview.mp4, 18.6 gigabytes, time-stamped March 15th. He checked his export logs. No file matched. I asked if a compilation could have been generated automatically by the system. He said no. The archive system did not create compilations. It only captured and stored raw footage. I asked if someone else could have accessed the archive and created the file. He said no. The archive was encrypted and access restricted to 2 individuals, himself and me. I opened the hard drive directory again. The archive compilation folder was still there. The file, Final Reviewed MP4, was listed. I opened it. The video played from the beginning. The title card appeared. The footage began. I fast-forwarded to the section showing my office on March 19th. I watched myself reviewing the archive at 4:37 p.m. I watched myself pause, check the metadata, and resume playback. I was watching the same footage I had watched minutes earlier. I fast-forwarded to the section showing my office on March 23rd. I was still working. I fast-forwarded to April, May, June. I was still there. I closed the file and accessed the live feed directory. I opened camera A12, the wall-mounted camera in my office. The live feed showed my office from the same angle as the archived footage. I was seated at my desk, staring at my computer. I waved my hand. On screen, my hand moved. The feed was live. I checked the timestamp. 4:59 p.m., March 19th. I accessed the archive and opened the file again. I fast-forwarded to the timestamp matching the current time. March 19th, 4:59 p.m. The footage showed my office. I was seated at my desk, waving my hand. The footage matched the live feed exactly. I fast-forwarded 1 minute. The timestamp read March 19th, 5 p.m. The footage showed me standing from my desk and walking to the door. I checked my watch. 4:59 p.m. I remained seated. I watched the footage. On screen, I opened the door at 5 p.m. and exited the office. I checked the live feed. I was still seated at my desk. I checked my watch. 5 p.m. I stood and walked to the door. I opened it and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was empty. I returned to my desk. I checked the footage. The timestamp read 5:01 p.m. I was seated at my desk. I was watching myself perform the actions I had just performed. I have continued reviewing the footage every day since March 19th. The file remains in the archive directory. The footage continues to extend beyond the present date. On March 22nd, I completed my final day and departed the facility at 2:53 p.m. I watched the footage that evening from home. The timestamp read March 22nd, 3:31 p.m. My office was empty. The lights were off. At 9:22 a.m. on March 23rd, the lights were on again. I was seated at my desk. I have not returned to the facility since March 22nd. But the footage continues to show me working in my office, conducting meetings, reviewing files, coordinating tasks. The timestamp advances daily. I check the archive every night. The footage is always current, and every night I am still there, seated at my desk, unaware that I have left. Some records never stop updating, even after everyone who maintained them is gone.